And when confronted with the realities of oil politics, Ecuador's governments have vacillated over, different governments having different policies at different times. They've vacillated over the extent to which petroleum policy should be nationalistic or more accommodating to the interests of foreign companies. Now, when the boom began, Ecuador's institutions had very little influence in the Amazon, but the discovery of black gold made the conquest of Amazonia a national imperative. It also provided infrastructure to penetrate remote areas and monies to support the military and bureaucracy. So Ecuador launched a policy of national integration to incorporate the Amazon into the national economy and assimilate its native peoples into the dominant national culture. The government promised land to settlers who migrated to the Amazon and pledged to civilize native peoples. But for the Guarani, 3?
4, 5 minutes.
I thought I had 20 minutes.
I'm sorry, we just started late.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. I thought I had 20 minutes. Okay. Do I? I can do 20-25? Okay. But for the Guarani, civilization meant rejecting their beliefs and way of life and entering the lowest social and economic levels of Ecuadorian society. And national integration meant that their homelands were occupied by outsiders. The first ones came from the sky, and over time, they dramatically transformed natural and social environments. The Guarani have borne the cost of oil extraction without sharing in its benefits and without participating in decision-making that affects them. It wasn't until 1990 that Ecuador began to recognize indigenous land rights and grant land titles to indigenous groups. By that time, they'd been displaced from many areas, but even so, the change in policy was an important development. In 1998, Ecuador recognized the multicultural nature of the country when it included indigenous rights in a new constitution. But the state continues to claim ownership of oil in native lands, and the implementation of indigenous rights has lagged. In the environmental arena, laws have included boilerplate environmental directives since at least 1971, but they haven't been enforced. Now, environmental protection in the oil patch depends on the use of technology, and Ecuador relied on Texaco as the operator of the fields to transfer petroleum technology. In its contract with the state, Texaco agreed to train Ecuadorian workers and turn over the operations to the state company Petroecuador in 1990. In the environmental law vacuum, Texaco set its own standards, so there was virtually no environmental protection. Workers who were trained by Texaco were so unaware of the hazards of crude oil during the 70s and 80s that they applied it to their hair to prevent balding. They sat in the sun, or they covered their head with a plastic cap overnight, and then to remove the crude, they washed their hair with diesel. In 1990, when government officials were confronted by international environmentalists with a study that documented appalling pollution, they professed ignorance. Texaco was their professor, they said. It taught them how to produce oil, but did not teach environmental protection. Now, oil production is an industrial activity. Texaco drilled more than 300 wells in an area that spans 1 million acres. The operations expanded incrementally, and by the time I got there in 1989, they were dumping more than 3 million gallons of toxic waste into the environment every day, a practice that's been prohibited in this country since 1979. The wastewater is extracted with the oil and separated at production stations. It's called produced water and typically contains hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and toxic levels of salts. It can also contain naturally occurring radioactive material. That and the salts and the high volume make treatment prohibitively costly. So the best practice, which Texaco chose not to use, is to re-inject produced water deep underground. And I should add that most companies now claim to re-inject, and in some areas that could mean significantly improved protection for critical water resources. But it's important to keep in mind that injection can contaminate groundwater and sometimes even surface waters and soils if the injection wells aren't properly designed, installed, operated, maintained, and monitored, and that costs a lot of money. In addition to known contamination from injected waste, the question of long-term confinement of injected waste is still unanswered. We just don't know enough about the behavior of injected waste. Once they're injected, the wastes are removed from control and their subsurface migration can't be accurately monitored. Now, in addition to the produced water, natural gas is also extracted with oil, but it's less profitable than oil, so most gas is burned as waste. Texaco no longer operates in Ecuador, but the facilities it built still burn tens of millions of cubic feet of gas every day as a waste, depleting a non-renewable resource, emitting greenhouse gases, and polluting the air and rain with particulate precursors of acid rain and other contaminants. Additional toxic wastes are generated by drilling and maintenance activities at well sites, and like produced water, they're dumped into open, unlined holes in the ground. The waste ponds are unlined, so toxic leachate contaminates groundwater, and when the ponds overflow from the heavy rains, when the ponds fill up because of the rain, they overflow. And hundreds of these ponds have been abandoned without proper cleanup. Texaco also applied untreated oil to roads for dust control and maintenance purposes. Now, oil companies typically build roads in order to lay pipelines and for in-field transportation. The roads in rainforests fragment habitat, disrupt drainage patterns, and can trigger disastrous indirect impacts like colonization and deforestation, because they provide outsiders with access into previously inaccessible rainforests. In addition to deliberate discharges and emissions, Texaco spilled, and accidental spills, nearly twice as much oil as the Exxon Valdez from the main pipeline alone, and it had no spill response plan, at least no environmental plan. Spilled and discharged waste can travel long distances or accumulate in low energy areas where there are ongoing sources of pollution. And so, not surprisingly, many streams that were once rich in fish now support almost no aquatic life, and many drinking water sources have been spoiled. As Texaco expanded its operations and advanced into Guarani territory, Guarani warriors tried to drive off the oil invaders with hardwood spears. So Texaco, Ecuador, and U.S.-based missionaries collaborated to pacify them and end their way of life. Using aircraft supplied by the company, missionaries made first contact and pressured and tricked Guarani clans into leaving areas where the company wanted to work. And some 200 Guarani went to live in a distant Christian settlement. Others moved deeper into the forest to get away. The Guarani who went with the missionaries were told that Guarani culture is sinful and savage, and were pressured to change and adopt the Christian way of life. It was a time of great suffering, as epidemics of new diseases that the Guarani had no resistance to sickened and killed many family members. After the Guarani were displaced, large areas of rainforest that had been their home were invaded and degraded by outsiders. In addition to the wells and pipelines and production stations, Texaco built a road into Guarani territory, and settlers used the road to colonize Guarani lands. Today, those areas are so degraded by oil field pollution and deforestation that the Guarani can no longer live there. And the colonists who live there attribute many health problems to the pollution. And the Guarani are concerned about the runoff from that area that reaches their territory along what they call the Big River.